And thank you so much for joining us today. We are really glad that you're here. Before we get started, we wanted to note just a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted during the duration of the webinar. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, go ahead and enter them into the question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen if you're viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of your screen if you're viewing from a phone. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, also enter those into the questions box. We'll review and address any immediate needs as they come up. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to each of you tomorrow. The recording will also be available on our website at www.namimimaryland.org. That's NAMIMD.org for any folks who were unable to register. After the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you'd like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and we ask that you please fill out this survey just to let us know how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. NAMI is excited to partner with BetterHelp to support our local healthcare workers by providing free access for a month to therapy. BetterHelp is convenient, private, online therapy where you can talk to a licensed professional therapist at any time. If you're a healthcare worker, including mental health and substance use provider, be sure to fill out the post-webinar feedback form to receive instructions and a discount code. I'll now hand it over to our moderator.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Linda Weinberg, a board member with NAMI Maryland, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. We're so excited that you're here to learn about mindfulness and how it can help you during this stressful and uncertain time. NAMI Maryland supports you in the hard work you do, and we want you to benefit from your time with us today. Mindfulness is the ability to stay in the present moment without judgment, a skill that can be cultivated and can result in improvements in stress, anxiety, and overall well-being. Today, we are hosting Dr. Neda Gould. She will teach us about the human stress response, give us research findings supporting mindfulness and meditation for stress and anxiety, and she'll tell us about the foundations of mindfulness practice. The session will include a presentation, a guided practice, and tools to bring mindfulness techniques to daily life. We're not offering CEUs today, but the certificate of attendance will be sent to each registered participant tomorrow afternoon. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Neda Gould. Dr. Gould is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She serves as the director of the Johns Hopkins Mindfulness Program, and following graduate school, she completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in psychology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine before joining the faculty. In addition to treating adult patients with anxiety and depression using cognitive behavioral therapy, one of her primary areas of interest is teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction and other mindfulness programs to patients with psychiatric and/or medical conditions, as well as to faculty and staff to address stress and burnout. Dr. Gould was recently inducted into the Johns Hopkins Medicine Miller-Coulson Academy of Clinical Excellence. She is a contributor to local and national media and news releases, and she lectures regularly to audiences on the benefits of mindfulness, meditation for health and well-being. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Gould. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to you about mindfulness. It's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, a tool that I have found very useful in my personal life in my professional world, and hope that you can walk away with some understanding of what it is and what it isn't, and also ways to begin to use it in your daily life. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So before we delve into some of the mindfulness, I want to talk a little bit about the stress response. So the human stress response, or the fight or flight response, is a beautifully designed system that we have in place that allows us to be prepared in moments of threat, whether that's real threat or perceived threat. We turn on this system and it gets us ready to fight, flee, or freeze. So our heart starts beating faster to pump blood to the large muscles of the body, and our breathing becomes more rapid. And many of us experience this daily. The issue is that this system isn't designed to be turned on as frequently as it's turned on nowadays. So the system was designed for in the caveman period, cavewoman period, to turn on when there was a threat by a saber-toothed tiger, and then for us to fight, flee, or freeze, and then to be able to run off and expel that adrenaline in our system and then return back to our baseline or homeostasis. And nowadays, if you think of the last time you were stressed, most often it's not an actual situation where the system needs to turn on. Sometimes it is, and that's good to have it turn on, but sometimes it's a thought. Or a stressful text or an email or a social interaction. And it's in these times where mindfulness can begin to be helpful, that mindfulness can begin to help us learn how to work with that stress. And I'll talk more about that. So chronic stress is associated with a lot of psychological and physical health ailments. I won't go into detail in this chart, but just we know that there's an association. It's not a direct causal link, but a complex. But we know that chronic stress isn't healthy for the body or the mind. So I hope that you do have a lot or at least some tools that you use for stress management, for self-care. So exercise, social support in whatever way you can use your social support these days, affiliations, whatever is helpful for you in terms of working with stress. Today, I hope I can add another tool to your toolbox with the mindfulness practice. Mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. Okay, so we're paying attention to what's happening internally and externally, but with a particular attitude of not judging the experience as good or bad, but rather beginning to just be curious about the experience. So instead of I like this, I don't like this, which is how we tend to approach situations, we're beginning to shift that to how interesting that this is here. And another way to think about that is when we're mindful in this moment, we're present for life and our experiences as they are, not as we hoped they would be or expected them to be, not seeing more or less of what's here, not with these judgments that lead us to conditioned reactions, but really being here with life as it unfolds moment to moment. So the opposite of being mindful is being on autopilot. And many of us are in this mode for much of the day. And so you can begin to think about examples where you might be in this mode, where we're mindless. We may be driving and thinking about what we're going to make for dinner, or doing the dishes, and thinking about a conversation from yesterday. So we're not fully engaged in the moment or the activity. So are some of the foundations of mindfulness practice. Some of these ideas and concepts are developed by John Kabat-Zinn. The reference is here. He's one of the founding fathers of mindfulness who brought it to the West and secularized it, made it really applicable to our society. And these are some of the foundations of emphasizes. So non-judging, patience, beginner's mind, trust, non-striving, acceptance, and letting go. And I'm just going to talk about. Okay, sorry. So non-judging, I mentioned, we're trying to begin to be open to experiences without holding on to ones we like and pushing away ones we don't like. A beginner's mind is looking at things with fresh eyes, as if from the eyes of a child, where they see something new each time. So if you've gone to if you had an interaction with a person over and over again, can you go in this time with some openness and look for something new? Non-striving. So in mindfulness practices, we're not striving for experiences to be a particular way. We're allowing them to be as they are in the moment. We're accepting how they are in the moment. Now, this does not mean that we accept life as it is and we don't try to make changes or improvements. It just means that in a particular moment, we accept the facts of what is true. And if we can do so, it actually helps us be able to make better decisions and wiser decisions and move through experiences, as opposed to trying to resist what's here. That takes up a lot of energy and can sometimes make us feel stuck. So when can we practice mindfulness? Theoretically, in every moment. I mean, that's not conceivable, but in theory, we can practice in every moment of every day. Another way to think about it, though, is that we're building a muscle, and we can do so with two components. One is formal mindfulness practice. So this is what we think of when we think of mindfulness meditation, or another form of meditation is sitting and bringing attention to some anchor of the present moment, maybe your breath or sensations in the body. And then we can couple that with informal mindfulness, when we notice we're on autopilot and we begin to redirect our attention back to the present. So we notice we're washing our hands and we're thinking about the next thing we have to do, or drinking our coffee and thinking about planning the day, coming back to that one experience. And both of these things are important components of building that muscle. So let me just talk about some myths about mindfulness. Many people say, I can't meditate, I have to empty my mind of thoughts. And the nice thing about the mindfulness meditation is that you don't have to empty your mind of thoughts. You begin to notice your thoughts. And in noticing the thoughts without kind of judging them or getting caught up in them, we get a little bit of distance from them. We don't believe that everything we think is true, or that we need to react to everything that we think. This is an important one. I should feel relaxed afterwards. People also share that, oh, well, this isn't working for me because I'm not feeling relaxed. And mindfulness is different than relaxation. So if you do something where you expect to feel relaxed, whatever that may be, a warm bath, a massage, whatever that may look like for you, your expectation or intention is that you feel relaxed afterwards. However, with mindfulness practices, in the moment or after one practice, you may or may not feel relaxed. And the reason is because we're beginning to turn towards experiences, even if they're challenging. But it just so turns out that a long-term byproduct of doing these practices regularly is relaxation, and a relaxation that we can call on and sustain. I'm too busy to practice. I'll be less productive if I'm focused on the present moment. It turns out that if we can actually take a few minutes a day to practice meditation or mindfulness, that we're actually more productive, that we also enjoy the tasks that we do to a greater degree. So even though it might take 5, 10, 15 minutes out of your day where you could be, responding to emails, or folding laundry or whatever we can do in that short period of time, it actually turns out that we're more productive if we can take this time to practice these practices. So let's talk a little more about what happens when we practice mindfulness. So it tunes us into the present. It makes it easier when we practice formal mindfulness meditation, and I'll guide you through a brief one today. It makes it easier to then be mindful during activities. It allows us to listen to our bodies. So we don't tend to listen to our bodies, and yet they give us so much information. So if you're going through the day, you can pause and notice tension in your shoulders or in your neck, and maybe just take a few deep breaths or roll your shoulders back and relax. And that can break some of that cycle that otherwise we just tend to build up over the course of the day into the evening, the cycle of stress. Mindfulness allows us to be more open and flexible. It increases our empathy, and it increases our ability to tolerate discomfort and uncertainty. And of course, we are just plagued with discomfort and uncertainty since the pandemic has started, and so it's really can be a helpful tool in that regard. Mindfulness in the workplace has been shown to help with job performance and job satisfaction, as well as problem-solving, decision-making, focus and concentration, and relationships. The problem-solving, decision-making, focus, and concentration use a specific part of our brain, the frontal lobes, which I'll talk about in a moment, and mindfulness tends to increase activity in that region of the brain. Looking at it a little bit more scientifically, what we see is that there's a lot of improvements in the same psychological and physical systems that I mentioned, but what we see most is, and consistently, is decreased stress, anxiety, depression, consistently across clinical and non-clinical populations, and also decreased pain severity and decreased pain disability. So these are aspects that we see consistently through the literature. These other areas we're also beginning to learn more about. I'll spend a few minutes talking about the brain. So we know from research that's been done on long-term meditators that their brains look different than our brains, the individuals who aren't long-term meditators. And those differences are interesting differences, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But what we know more recently from research is that we don't have to become long-term meditators to derive some of the benefits from mindfulness practices, meaning you don't have to dedicate your life to becoming a monk or a nun. That even after 8 weeks of consistent practice, there are some studies that show similar brain changes to those of long-term meditators. And this was a review study that basically took all of the articles that it could find on imaging in individuals who took this mindfulness-based stress reduction course, which is a course developed by an individual named John Kabat-Zinn and is now an evidence-based nationally and internationally offered course. This is a course I teach for patients at Johns Hopkins, as well as for faculty and staff to address stress and burnout. And so what are some of these changes that this review article pointed out? Well, studies showed increased activity and connectivity in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain that makes us smarter than all the other animals. It's our frontal lobe where we make executive functioning decisions, we plan, we have hindsight and foresight. The hippocampus, we see increased activity and even increased volume. Some studies have shown in this area of the brain involved in memory formation. We see these positive changes in some studies in areas involved in self-awareness and perception, in emotional regulation. And then if we come back to the fight or flight response, the amygdala is the part of the brain that turns on during the fight or flight response. So a primitive part of the brain that before we're even able to process a situation fully, this system turns on and tells us there's danger. And so what we see with regular mindfulness practice is decreased activity in this region when this region doesn't need to turn on. So you get that stressful email, we don't need to go into full fight or flight mode if it's not life-threatening or threatening to a loved one. And so there's earlier deactivation to those emotional stimuli where the system does not need to be turned on. I've mentioned this course a few times. It is it's an 8-week course where we meet once a week for 2.5 hours and then a full day meditation retreat and then home practice with guided meditation based on this book, Full Catastrophe Living. Since the pandemic, I've been teaching this course virtually and have modified it to 8 weeks for 1.5 hours because being on Zoom for 2.5 hours is quite a long time. Many other practitioners who offer this have also begun to offer it via virtually. However, you can still find courses that are offered in person. And my hope is to be able to return back to in-person courses as well. I wanted to just put a slide or two on how mindfulness can be helpful in communication, because so much of our distress can come from this, especially as many of us are in close quarters with family members if you're because of the pandemic, or just being stressed in general and then carrying that to work with us. And so when we're stressed, we are mindless and we tend to react. Our amygdala, that part of the brain from the fight or flight response, is activated. We get caught up in our fear, anxiety, and our stories. And this is when we might say something we didn't intend to say, or we snap at somebody or send that email that we wish we hadn't sent. And so if we can begin to practice mindfulness, and I'll talk about some ways to begin even today, we activate the prefrontal cortex, that wise part of our brain that allows us to see our options, to make wiser choices. And we're much more likely to respond rather than react. We're much more likely to practice assertive communication, which is respectful of ourselves, our needs, as well as those of the other individual, as opposed to aggressive or passive aggressive communication. So normally I have a whole segment I would talk about in terms of mindful communication, but this is the one slide that I personally really use a lot, especially during stressful communications. And it's, can you make your speech King Tut, which is kind, truthful, useful, and timely. And I learned this on a meditation retreat once by a wonderful teacher. Her name was Mary Aubrey, and it's really stuck with me. And so I'll think to myself during stressful situations, is what I'm going to say kind? Is it truthful? Is it useful? And even if all of those things are true, is this the right time to say it? So how can we begin to incorporate mindfulness into our days? One simple tool is to just pause and take 3 deep breaths. Okay, you can think of this as a way to reset wherever you are and whatever you're caught up in. You can begin the day with this, you can end the day with this. You can also incorporate it just into moments throughout your day or when you're feeling triggered. Okay, so 3 deep inhalations, 3 long, slow exhalations. You can bring attention to your senses. Our senses always reside in the present moment. Our thoughts don't always reside in the present moment. So we have an opportunity to come back to the present moment by focusing on any of our senses. Pausing before transitioning to a new task. And this could be just taking a deep breath, just noticing again your senses. Pausing before picking up your phone. So picking up our phone is such an automated behavior, and we do it hundreds of times throughout the day, and it can be a source of stress. Of course, we need it to communicate, or it's useful to communicate, but it also is something where we very easily can go into that mindlessness, that we can hop on social media or start checking emails or texts, and we get caught up in these experiences without really being fully aware. So we're checking email while we're walking to our car or whatever that may be. And so we can pause, and sometimes we don't even need to pick up our phone as frequently as we do. For example, if you're in a meeting and then you get an email about something totally unrelated, it's totally distracting. And the question is, did I need to check my email right then and there? Sometimes there are emergencies, especially if you're frontline workers and you need to know, or you need to know where your children are. But sometimes we may be able to put that aside and really be more present. Label your emotion. So there's a saying, if you can name it, you can tame it. So if you can identify your emotion, especially if it's a negative emotion or an unpleasant one, such as I'm feeling angry or irritable or sad, it begins to give us a little bit of space so we don't get so caught up in that emotion, and then we can kind of be with it in a easier way. Beginning to catch yourself when you're on autopilot. So I'd encourage you to choose one activity that you do daily and you tend to do on autopilot, and see if you can do that with a little bit more mindfulness, with putting other things aside and just focusing on your senses, and then having some form of a mindfulness reminder. It is very easy for us to just fall back into our habits, and this takes a lot of practice and it's hard work. And so having something to help remind you, it can be an app, it can be every time you get a text before you check it. It can be beginning to find other groups or resources to meditate with, but something to remind us to come back to the present. So I mentioned coming to your senses. This is an easy way to remember that, this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 practice. So you don't have to do it in this particular order, but 5 things you see. So at any point, pausing and noting 5 things you see and 4 things you can feel, and so on. And this can help, again, just a brief practice that we can do, we can share with others to help ground us in the present. This one can also be helpful for kids to, because it's very concrete, and help them come back to the present moment. So we can bring mindfulness to all of our activities, and eating is one of them. Most of the time, we don't tend to make eating a task in and of itself where we put everything else aside. Most of us don't. It's wonderful if you are able to do that, but there are opportunities to use mindfulness in our daily life, and this is one of them. And so again, every time we do this, we're building that muscle of mindfulness, whether it's eating or taking a shower or going for a walk, when we can be fully present. And so I'd encourage you to maybe one meal or a snack, see if you can set time aside, eat it alone, no phone, no conversation, using all of your senses, really slowing down and putting your fork down between bites, and just seeing what that experience is like. This is perhaps my favorite tool, and it is when you are confronted with a stressful experience, to just state the facts of that event in a sentence. Okay. Um, my Zoom is having difficulty connecting, or I'm running late. Uh, then notice all those thoughts that you add on to this. Okay. All of those thoughts that make an already stressful situation so much worse. What if my Zoom doesn't connect? Oh my gosh, I should have checked this sooner. I'm so irresponsible. I can't get anything right. You know, all of those stories we get caught up in, and just come back to the facts. My Zoom, my computer is having trouble connecting, and that's stressful in of itself. But we have an opportunity to notice how our mind can perpetuate that cycle. There are lots of different ways to practice breathing. I just found this one in terms of, you can do the 3-breath break, of course. This one is easy to remember, that it's square breathing. So if you'd like to do it with me now, you breathe in for 4 seconds, and you can imagine that you're in your mind, you're drawing a square. Hold for 4 seconds. Breathe out for 4 seconds. And hold for 4 seconds. You can even draw the square with your hand in the air if you're on your own and in a space where you can do so. There are tons of meditation resources. There are UCLA and UCSD have these free guided meditations that you can use on their websites. If you Google, mindfulness meditation, you'll get thousands of hits on YouTube or audio files that you can use. There are some very popular apps. Calm and Headspace are 2 really popular ones, but there are hundreds. Insight Timer is a nice one. It's free, whereas Calm and Headspace, you have to, there's a portion of it that's free, but if you want the full access to the full premium version, then you have to pay a monthly fee. But Insight Timer is free. You just have to kind of search for what you're looking for, because it has thousands of meditations on it. But those are some places to begin. I lead daily mindfulness sessions on Wednesdays at noon. I started these in March 2020 when the pandemic hit, and was running them 3 times a day, and then decreased to once a day, and now once a week. And there's a small group of individuals that come together. It had started initially for faculty and staff and employees at Hopkins, and now the link has been shared more broadly, so you can feel free to drop in for this if you'd like to. So I'd like to do a brief practice, and then I will turn it over back to Linda for our question and answers. So if you'd like to participate, you can just find a comfortable position for yourself seated in your chair. Some tips for the mindfulness practices: you can do them seated, you can do them lying down. The issue, of course, is that to learn these practices, you want to stay awake. They can be very helpful for sleep, especially looking up practices such as the body scan. Those can be helpful for drifting off to sleep. But for our purposes today, and for purposes of actually building that muscle, you'd want to be awake. And so if you're seated in a chair, you can have both your feet flat on the floor if that's comfortable. Gently placing your hands in your lap in whatever position feels comfortable. So of course, finding a position that's comfortable enough that you can sustain for these few minutes that we'll engage in this practice. I'll invite you to close your eyes, but you don't have to. You can also just have a soft, unfocused gaze in front of you. And to settle in, we'll begin by just taking a few deep breaths. A nice deep breath in, filling your lungs with air. And then a long, slow exhalation. One more time, deep breath in, filling your lungs with air. Releasing slowly. And one more time, deep breath in. And as you exhale, letting go of where you were a few moments ago, letting go of where you need to be later today, and just come back to this one moment, returning your breathing back to its normal rhythm. Sense places your body comes into contact with the chair. Pressure against your thighs and your buttocks. Perhaps pressure against your back coming into contact with the seat of the chair, with the back of the chair. Sensing your feet coming into contact with the floor. And noticing sensations in your hands. And of course, you've noticed probably by now that the mind also wanders. This is perfectly natural and expected. Be gentle with your mind. And when you notice that it's wandered, just softly let go of where it wandered to and gently, with kindness, come back to what we're focused on. And let's take a moment to focus on sounds around us. Sounds nearby and farther away. Let's take a moment to just notice how we're feeling emotionally. Trying not to make our experience wrong in any way. Trying not to get caught up in why we feel a certain way, but just labeling it in a word or two. And then gently coming back to the breath. Breathing in, sensing that you're breathing in, breathing out, sensing that you're breathing out. You can bring attention to the tip of the nostrils and sense the air as you breathe in, as you breathe out. You can place your attention on the belly, rising and falling. And we note when the mind wanders, and we just begin again. And this is the practice. Letting go and beginning again. And we'll slowly begin to transition out of this practice. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes. Begin to move your fingers and your toes. Take a moment to stretch out. So thank you for taking the time to participate in that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Linda for the Q&A. I think you're, Linda, are you on mute?
I was on mute. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Gould, for that really helpful information that's so important during this time of need. We'd like to open up the webinar to questions now. We have some that we've received already. If you would like to ask a question, remember you're still going to be muted to avoid background noise, but you can type your question into the question box at the right-hand side of your screen if you're using a computer, or at the bottom of the screen if you're using a phone. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, or if you have a comment about the webinar, just enter those into the questions box now. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we'll provide contact information at the end of the webinar for anyone who wants to reach us. So without further ado, we have a question from Raina, which is, could mindfulness ever turn into hyperfixation? And I think we have kind of a related question, which is, when is staying in the moment inappropriate and not a solution for a problem?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. Yeah, so in terms of can mindfulness turn into hyperfixation, I guess what Raina is asking is, can we become so stuck in it? Is the way I understood it, that we just fixate on one thing. Certainly that's possible. I think the practice of meditation and mindfulness actually does the opposite. The practice is to notice what comes and let it go. And things can feel sticky. We can become fixated on something during the process of meditation. But with practice, if we can let those things go, then we're less likely to sense that stickiness. So that related question of is it ever inappropriate to be mindful and it gets in the way of problem solving? I think that we get mixed up in the difference between being mindful and then sitting and meditating. So if you're in the midst of solving a problem, you may not want to go into a meditative state. Sometimes it can be helpful if you have the time and space and you're feeling stuck, but it's never a problem to be mindful, be aware, be present. It doesn't mean that we don't plan and problem solve. It means that when we're planning and problem solving, we're aware that we're planning and problem solving. And then when we're doing the dishes, we're not also trying to solve other problems as well.
Camille has a very practical question, which is, are your weekly sessions free?
They are, yeah. They're open to the public. They're free, yes.
Okay. Katie says that she's been told to use ACT for panic and anxiety. She's steered away from meditation. When is the right time to do one or the other?
Yeah, so ACT stands for acceptance and commitment therapy that Katie mentions, and that can be effective for anxiety and panic. I use cognitive behavioral therapy for panic and anxiety, and it doesn't have to be either or. So you can use the meditation and mindfulness practices generally, so maybe at a fixed time every day. What you don't want to do with panic and anxiety is to use this as a tool to escape those feelings and experiences. So when you think of ACT or cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea is to be with those experiences. And mindfulness can actually, if you do it regularly, can actually help you be with those experiences more when you do some form of exposure or ACT-based therapy.
Okay. Do you have any specific recommendations for people to improve their mental health when they are in quarantine or in lockdown conditions?
Sure. So it's not easy. I think it doesn't look the same for every person, but really try to focus on some self-care, first of all. I think that, again, looks different for everybody. So whether it's socializing virtually or on the phone, doing some form of practice of mindfulness or exercise, really try to prioritize with that. I think also thinking about what is in your control and what isn't, and focusing on the things that are in your control. And then people have shared online starting some new hobby, or I look at it more broadly of try to find one thing that you enjoy to do, even if it's small, each day, because it can be so hard to be at home quarantined or in lockdown or whatever the circumstances are, but we can still have some things that are in our control that we can engage in.
That's really good advice. I have two questions here that are related. Tracy asked, how would you suggest introducing mindfulness to teens? And are there particular practices that work for that age group? And then we had another question about how can we help students integrate some of the practices and information. I assume that may mean during school or perhaps study from home even.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't work with teens and children, but you can use all of the same practices. You just have to put it in their language and in a space that they can hear it. So I think modifying some of those, I don't have particular practices that I would recommend for teens. I think if you did a search, there are actual programs that are designed for teens that would probably be useful. In terms of bringing it kind of to children and students, I think the first thing you want to do, and this applies to the teens, is to model it yourself. Okay, so what helps you, sharing that, what websites or apps help you, and of course teens are very website and app focused, so you could get them started on some of those programs as a way in. And then bringing it to kind of students, I think in a classroom setting, again, modeling and incorporating it into the day. And children often have a shorter attention span, so it might have to be little spurts. But for example, I know with breathing with little kids, the preschoolers used to say you smell the flowers as you breathe in and blow out the pizza. So you just need to modify it to their language.
All right. Alania asked if I wanted to utilize mindfulness among my work staff or a group of individuals who are interested, what qualities, what would qualify me, that is her, to utilize the practice of mindfulness?
Mm-hmm. So to do mindfulness or to share these tools with your staff or your family, you don't need a certification. So you can, I think the way I started before I was certified was I would find an app that I liked or an audio that I liked, and we would turn it on and listen to it as a group. Eventually, I got certified because I wanted to use this clinically, and if you want to use it clinically, it's recommended that you go through some training for it. But for your staff, use some of the tools that you find online, do it together. You can guide them through a brief breathing exercise. There are also scripts online that you can get and read to your staff if you want to actually lead it yourself. I think you want to be careful when about one thing when it comes to mindfulness. Well, a couple of things. One is that you want to know the people you're leading in the session. If you're going to practice regularly and what may show up with them. What happens when we pause with mindfulness is that anything's fair game to kind of come into our consciousness because we're not distracting ourselves. And for people, for example, who might have a history of trauma or who are in the midst of your depressive episodes, that can be really challenging to work with. So in those situations, you want to be mindful of, who is there and how can I direct them to services if they need it.
Okay. Michael has asked, are there any retreat locations or sites that you would recommend? And how long should one meditate daily?
Mm-hmm. So locally, I think the best place to find some retreats is to go to the Insight Meditation Community of Washington. That's imcw.org, and they have a ton of classes and retreats that you can go to. There are others, but that's kind of an organization that's local. And the other question, sorry, what was the other question?
The other question was, how long should one meditate daily?
Yeah, so there's no magic number. It depends on the circumstances. I tell people, if you can start with 10 or 15 minutes and try to build up to, a half hour every day. The longer you go, the more insight you might develop, the deeper you go into some of the practices. But for some people, 5 minutes might be what they can start with, or 5 minutes might be what they can incorporate, and that's okay. All of it counts.
Okay. Can this type of practice be used for people experiencing grief?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I think grief is a challenging emotion. I think that if you're in the midst of grief, one way I would recommend some modifications would be to maybe start small with some of the practices, so shorter duration. I would also think about using sensations in the body as an anchor. So what are you feeling in the body, and just noting emotions as opposed to getting caught up in some of the cognitions around the grief. Broadly speaking, we can step back with the mindfulness, and there's a question we can ask ourselves: what's here? And then the follow-up question: can I make some space for this? Can I be with this? And if the answer is yes, then kind of make some space for that experience. If the answer is no, it's just overwhelming, that's okay. Pull back, get up from the practice and do something else, and you can revisit those two questions.
Susan asked a question that I know occurs to a lot of us, and that is screens and information overload, phones, etc., computers. How can we all take a break from this type of encompassing trap? It has taken over every part of our lives. I think we all agree with that.
Yeah, it's so hard. I sometimes give these, when I used to do them in person, give the lectures, I would say, okay, I want to collect everyone's phones. People would really panic. And so I think one way is to start small and build times where you're not with your phone or other computer if you're able to, and unless you need it. The other is that you can practice making these little mini retreats for yourself. If you actually go on a silent retreat, that's a sure way to kind of put your phone completely away, but you don't need to go to that extreme all of a sudden. I would just start with small bits where you put your phone, turn it off and put it aside if you're able to, and then build from there and see what that's like.
Yes, and a related question to the question about grief that we talked about earlier. Lauren said that she recently had a tragedy that caused her so much grief, and it felt like her body is always so sore. Are there any extra tips for addressing those types of physical sensations?
I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. So I guess a few things. One is making space for, in a mindfulness way, we would make space for those physical sensations, and then and not make them wrong or feel like we have to push them away. But I think it could also be helpful to do some form of gentle yoga and stretching each day if you're noticing that you're holding a lot of kind of tension in the body.
Any particular practices that you would recommend for self-care for parents or frontline workers during COVID?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think, again, the same, all of the practices are applicable, but sometimes what happens in those situations is time is an issue. So I think that practicing those like 3 breath breaks, breaking the meditation down into small doses. So you might not be able to sit for 20 minutes, but can you sit for, take 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening or during your lunch break, and then bringing mindfulness to the daily activities. Those situations can also be really stressful. So again, noticing your stress and just labeling your emotions can be a helpful, simple tool throughout the day, as opposed to just letting it build.
Jason asked about apps that are good to use for mindfulness, and I know that you mentioned a couple during your presentation. Would you mind repeating those and any others that you think are useful?
Sure. The ones that are popular, I don't have a particular motivation for a person to use one or the other. The Calm app is popular. Headspace are popular. Those are some ones that have been around a while. There's one called 10% Happier. There's one called Buddhify. You can also just Google these on, and then there's one that's free that I like. It's called Insight Timer.
I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Deanna?
Thank you so very, very much for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Gould, for such a wonderful and such valuable information. Linda, thank you so much for volunteering your time this afternoon. It was just an exceedingly useful discussion. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be emailed to registrants tomorrow. The webinar will also be uploaded to our website at www.namimd.org for anybody who was unable to register for today's webinar. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you this afternoon. At the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting the educational webinars, and this survey will help determine how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. NAMI has partnered with BetterHelp to support our local healthcare workers by providing access to a free month of therapy. BetterHelp is convenient, private, online therapy where you can talk to a licensed professional therapist at any time. If you are a healthcare worker, including mental health or substance use provider, be sure to fill out that post-webinar feedback form to receive instructions and your discount code. Don't forget that you all are invited to join us on Thursday, February 10th at 8 a.m. for our virtual advocacy day. This is your chance to act for mental health right here in our state and to hear from Maryland leaders about how they plan to make mental health a priority in 2022. Remember, advocates like you allow us to lead rigorous and successful year-long policy and advocacy efforts, and we certainly welcome your involvement. You can register now at the link in the chat that I'm sure Danielle has probably already put up there for you. We wish you all a safe and healthy rest of your week, and don't hesitate to reach out to us through our website or by phone at 410-884-8691 should you need additional resources or support. We wish you a wonderful rest of your day. And again, for additional resources or support, just visit our website at www.namimd.org or give us a call at 410-884-8691. Have a great day, everybody.